Remember those cooking habits your nan had that made absolutely no sense until you tasted the result? The dripping tin sitting beside the stove. The stock pot that never seemed to fully empty. The way she could turn 3 sad ingredients into something that made you want to pull up a chair and stay for hours. We have been chasing convenience ever since we forgot these habits. And somewhere between the microwave meals and the meal kit deliveries, we lost something real. Something that made food taste like it actually meant something. Hi, my name is Albert, and this is Old Australian. Saving dripping in a billy tin. If you walked into an Australian kitchen any time before 1980 and looked beside the stove, you would find it. Not hidden away in a cupboard, not tucked out of sight. Right there in the open, comfortable as anything. An old billy tin or a repurposed jam jar sitting with quiet authority, half full of rendered fat. Is it beef dripping mostly? Sometimes mutton. Sometimes a glorious mixture of both that nobody could quite identify, but everyone agreed tasted incredible. Nobody asked questions. You just used it. Aussie home cooks never threw away the fat left in the roasting pan. Not once. Not ever. After a Sunday lamb roast or a tray of beef brisket came out of the oven, that golden liquid was carefully poured off and stored before the pan even had a chance to cool properly. It hardened as it sat into something pale and rich and deeply savory. And then it went into absolutely everything. Fried eggs in the morning, sautéed onions for the midweek chops, roasted potatoes on a Sunday, toast whenever the mood struck, which was often, especially toast, always toast. Nothing, and I mean nothing, beats dripping on hot toast with a pinch of salt. If you have never tried it, I am genuinely sorry for every breakfast you have ever had. You deserved better, and did not know it. This was not laziness or frugality, though it was certainly both of those things too. It was flavor management of the highest order. Every tin held the memory of every roast that came before it. Layers of Sunday dinners going back weeks. And every single meal cooked in that fat tasted just a little bit richer, a little bit deeper, a little bit more like home. That is not an accident. That is a habit worth keeping. Making bread and butter custard from stale loaves bread in an Australian household before the 1970s did not get thrown out. That was practically a rule. Unspoken but ironclad. When the loaf went stale and nobody wanted it for sandwiches anymore, it did not go to the bin. It went into a baking dish with eggs, milk, sugar, and a scraping of butter, and it came out of the oven as bread and butter custard. This was Depression-era thinking that stuck around long after the Depression ended because it worked too well to abandon. The stale bread actually made a better custard than fresh bread. It absorbed the egg mixture more deeply, gave the pudding a denser, more satisfying texture, and held its shape when you scooped it into a bowl. A handful of sultanas on top if you were lucky. A dusting of nutmeg if Nan was feeling fancy. Every school in Australia had at least one kid whose Nan made this on a Sunday and sent them to school Monday with the leftovers cold in a container. That kid was always popular at lunch, and rightfully so. It was humble, yes, but it was also genuinely delicious, and it used every last crumb of a loaf that had earned its keep. Stretching mince with rolled oats ground beef was not cheap. It never really was. And in a household feeding 4 or 5 kids on a single income, you had to be strategic about it. So Australian home cooks did what cooks the world over had quietly figured out. They mixed rolled oats into their mince, not a sprinkle, either, a proper handful, stirred right through the raw meat along with onion, Worcestershire sauce, salt, and whatever else was going into the rissoles or the meatloaf. The oats soaked up the fat and the juices as it cooked. They gave the mixture a texture that held together beautifully and kept the meat moist from the inside out. And here's the thing, nobody could tell. Kids who would have complained endlessly about anything unfamiliar ate these rissoles without a word of protest because they tasted exactly like rissoles should taste. Maybe better. The oats added a subtle earthiness that made the meat seem richer somehow. It was a trick born of necessity, but it earned its place at the table on its own merit. And some nans never stopped using it, even when money was no longer tight. That tells you everything you need to know. Boiling the kettle for everything. This one sounds simple because it is, but do not underestimate it. In the Australian kitchen of the 1940s, 50s and 60s, the kettle was basically a co-chef. It was on the boil constantly, and it was used for far more than tea, though the tea was non-negotiable, obviously. Boiling water was added to thin out gravies and soups without diluting the flavour the way cold water would. It was poured over dried fruits to plump them up before going into a cake. It was used to blanch vegetables quickly before frying so they cooked through evenly. It was added to the roasting pan halfway through cooking to stop the meat from drying out and to start building the base of the gravy at the same time. The logic was sound and the results were consistently better. Hot water integrates into food differently than cold. It does not shock the pan, does not seize the proteins, does not drop the temperature and ruin the timing of whatever you had going. Aussie cooks understood this without ever reading a food science textbook. They just knew. The kettle was always on, and the food was always better for it. Wrapping sandwiches in greaseproof paper plastic bags were not always a fixture of Australian kitchens. And even once they arrived, a lot of households were slow to switch over from greaseproof paper because greaseproof paper was simply better at the job. Sandwiches wrapped tightly in greaseproof paper and tucked into a school port or a work lunchbox stayed fresh in a way that plastic never quite managed. The paper breathed just enough to stop the bread going soggy, while still keeping the filling contained and the whole package cool. A Vegemite and cheese sandwich wrapped in greaseproof paper at 7 in the morning was still perfectly edible at 12:30. The same sandwich in a plastic bag was a warm, limp disappointment. I speak from experience on both counts. There was also something about the ritual of wrapping that mattered. You folded the paper neatly, tucked the ends under, and the sandwich arrived looking like someone had thought about it, which someone had. That counted for something when you were 8 years old and opening your lunchbox in a dusty school quadrangle. Food wrapped with care tastes better. I am convinced of this. Nan would agree. Making stock from lamb bones. The Sunday roast lamb was never really over when the plates were cleared. That was just the first act. The bones went straight into a pot of cold water with an onion cut in half, a few peppercorns, some celery tops, and whatever carrot scraps were hanging around. Then it went on the stove on the lowest possible heat, and it just sat there for hours, sometimes overnight. By morning, the kitchen smelled extraordinary, like something between a hug and a proper meal. The stock was strained and cooled, skimmed of fat, and stored in the fridge in old jam jars. And then it went into everything for the rest of the week. Soups, gravies, risottos, before we called them risottos, braised vegetables, sauces for chops. Nothing you buy in a carton from the supermarket comes close to what those bones produced. Not even slightly. The gelatin that came out of slow-simmered lamb bones gave the stock a body and a richness that you could feel on your lips. It was the kind of ingredient that made everything around it taste more considered, more complete. Aussie cooks did this without thinking. And then, one day, they stopped, and the food got noticeably worse. Using condensed milk in everything sweetened condensed milk had a very specific smell when you opened the tin. Thick, caramel sweet, and somehow already nostalgic the moment it hit the air. And in the Australian kitchen, it was used with a confidence bordering on recklessness. In a good way, it went into fudge and caramel slice. It went into Anzac biscuit variations and into no-bake cheesecakes pressed into a crumb base. It was stirred into coffee when the fresh milk ran out. It was drizzled over tinned peaches as a perfectly acceptable dessert on a weeknight. It was boiled in the tin for 3 hours to make caramel that went straight into a tart shell and was eaten before it properly set, because nobody had that kind of patience. The beauty of condensed milk was its shelf life and its intensity. A little went a long way, and it could transform the plainest set of ingredients into something that felt indulgent. Australian women's auxiliary groups and church cookbook committees built entire dessert sections around the stuff. Rightfully so. It was the great equalizer of the Aussie pantry. Rich flavour on a tight budget. And somehow it made everything it touched taste like a special occasion. Reviving stale biscuits in the oven. Here is one that sounds almost too simple to bother writing down, which is probably why nobody wrote it down and it got forgotten. When biscuits went soft, you did not throw them out. You put them in a low oven for about 10 minutes and you got them back. Not just edible, actually crisp. The gentle heat drove out the moisture that had softened them and returned them to something very close to their original texture. Arrowroot biscuits, SAOs, ginger snaps, even a sad Tim Tam that had lost its snap could be partially rescued with this method. Alright, nothing fully rescues a sad Tim Tam, but you try anyway. This habit came from a generation that simply could not afford to waste a biscuit. A packet of biscuits was a treat. Letting them go to ruin because you left the tin open was careless and unnecessary when the oven was right there. The low and slow approach meant nothing scorched. You checked them, you pulled them out, you let them cool on a rack, and suddenly afternoon tea was back on. It was thrift disguised as kitchen wisdom, which is really what most of the best cooking habits are when you get down to it. Storing butter under a wet clay pot. Before refrigerators were standard in every Australian home, keeping butter from turning rancid in summer was a genuine problem. And the solution that most households landed on was both brilliantly simple and surprisingly effective. You placed the butter dish on a plate with a small amount of water, then covered it with an unglazed terracotta pot. The clay absorbed the water, and as it evaporated, it cooled the air underneath, enough to keep the butter firm and fresh for days. This was essentially a rudimentary evaporative cooler, and it worked on the same principle as a Coolgardie safe, which was a staple of outback Australian homes going back to the late 1800s. Hessian bags, water, airflow. The Australian climate basically forced people into becoming amateur refrigeration engineers. The butter that came out of this arrangement was also consistently at a perfect spreading temperature. Not rock hard from the fridge. Not melted into a greasy puddle from the heat. Just right. Perfectly soft, ready to go straight onto toast or damper without tearing the bread to shreds. Anyone who has wrestled cold butter across a soft slice knows exactly why this mattered. Turning leftover damper into pudding damper is one of those things that is extraordinary when it is fresh and challenging when it is not. A 2-day-old damper is a doorstop. A slightly stale damper in the hands of a resourceful Australian cook, however, is the beginning of a pudding. The technique was almost identical to bread and butter custard. The damper was sliced or torn into rough chunks and layered into a greased dish. A custard mixture of eggs, milk, and sugar was poured over the top. Sometimes golden syrup was drizzled through. Sometimes a handful of dried fruit was scattered between the layers. Then it went into a moderate oven and came out transformed. The damper absorbed the custard and puffed slightly in the heat, giving the pudding a denser, more rustic texture than the bread version. It had a faint flavour of the campfire or the wood stove that came through even after baking, which gave it a character you simply could not manufacture. This was food that tasted like the land it came from, and it started as something people nearly threw away. The best things usually do. Making gravy from pan scrapings. There are gravies, and then there is proper Australian roast gravy made from the pan scrapings after the meat came out to rest. These are two entirely different things and should not be discussed in the same sentence. The stuff that comes in a packet or a jar is a decent impersonator. What Nan made in that roasting pan is the original. After the roast was resting on the board, the pan went straight onto the stovetop over medium heat. The fat was poured off, leaving behind those dark, caramelized bits stuck to the bottom. A splash of water or stock went in, and the cook scraped every single one of those bits free with a wooden spoon. That was the flavor. That was years of knowing what to do and when to do it. Flour was whisked in to thicken. More stock added slowly, a good grind of pepper, and sometimes a dash of Worcestershire. The whole thing bubbled and deepened and reduced into something that bore absolutely no resemblance to a powder mixed with boiling water. This gravy was the reward for the roast, and Australians knew how to collect that reward properly. Pickling vegetables in the fridge. Long before pickling became fashionable enough to appear on the menu of every inner-city brunch spot, Australian home cooks were quietly doing it in their kitchens for entirely practical reasons. Cucumbers, onions, cauliflower, even green beans. If the produce drawer was getting ahead of itself, the pickling jar came out. A quick brine of white vinegar, sugar, salt, and whatever spices were in the cupboard. Mustard seeds if you had them. A dried chili if someone in the house was feeling adventurous. The vegetables went in, the jar was sealed, and 2 days later you had something tangy and crisp that made a cold meat sandwich absolutely sing. These refrigerator pickles lasted for weeks and transformed otherwise plain meals into something with actual brightness and contrast. Australians put them alongside cold mutton, tucked them into a roll with Devon and tomato sauce, or served them on a cheese board when company came over unexpectedly. They made the food around them taste better simply by being there, sharp and clean and lively against things that might otherwise be a bit beige. Every fridge should have a jar of something pickled in it. Most do not anymore. That is a shame. Coating meat in flour before frying. This is one of those habits that disappeared quietly and took the flavor with it. Before a chop or a piece of chicken or a slice of liver hit the pan, it got dredged in seasoned flour. Plain flour mixed with salt and pepper, sometimes a pinch of paprika, sometimes a little dry mustard powder. The meat was pressed into it on both sides, and then it went straight into a hot pan with dripping or butter. The flour created a thin crust that sealed the outside of the meat quickly, kept the juices from escaping, and gave the whole thing a golden color that made it look like something worth sitting down for. It also left beautiful brown bits in the bottom of the pan that became the base of the sauce, or the gravy. Nothing wasted, everything used. Modern recipes skip this step constantly in the name of keeping things simple. But simple is not always better. Sometimes simple just means fewer layers of flavor. The flour step took 30 seconds, and it made a meaningful difference to the texture and the taste of whatever was being cooked. Australian home cooks knew this. They did it without being asked, and dinner was better for it. Using a wet tea towel to proof dough. No proving drawer, no plastic wrap, no purpose-built proofing box. Just a clean, damp tea towel draped over the bowl and a warm corner of the kitchen. That was how bread dough rose in Australian homes for generations. And it worked just as well as any of the modern alternatives. Possibly better, honestly. The damp cloth kept the surface of the dough from drying out and forming a skin, while still allowing the yeast to breathe and do its work. It also had the benefit of making the whole kitchen smell faintly of warm dough and possibility, which is one of the genuinely great smells of domestic life. Second only to dripping toast, in my personal ranking. That list is not up for debate. Cooks developed a feel for when the dough was ready that no timer could replicate. They pressed it gently, watched it spring back, held a hand near the surface to feel the warmth coming off it. This was baking by instinct and experience. The tea towel was just the tool that made the space for that knowledge to operate in. Bread baked this way had a character to it, a slightly uneven crumb, a crust with personality. You could taste the patience in it. Keeping a compost corner in the kitchen. Not a compost bin in the modern, council-approved, colour-coded sense. A corner of the kitchen bench with a chipped bowl or an old saucepan sitting in it where the vegetable scraps went. Carrot tops, onion skins, potato peelings, celery leaves. The outer layers of anything that was not going into the pot today. Some of those scraps went into the garden. Some went to the chooks out the back if you were lucky enough to have them. And a significant portion of them, particularly the more aromatic ones, went straight into the stock pot. Because a serious Australian cook knew that an onion skin gave colour to a broth. That celery tops were more flavoursome than the stalks. That carrot peel still had everything worth having in it. This habit was not environmentalism, although it was that too. It was simply the understanding that flavour lives in the whole vegetable, not just the neat, trimmed, peeled version of it. And throwing that flavour away because it did not look pretty on the plate was wasteful in a way that a post-war Australian cook would find genuinely baffling. The scrap bowl was a resource. Treated as such, it made the food extraordinary. Making dripping toast for breakfast. We touched on dripping earlier, and I make no apology for returning to it because dripping toast deserves its own chapter, its own monument, and frankly, its own public holiday. This was the breakfast of Australian childhoods from Federation through to roughly 1975, when someone decided that margarine on white bread was an acceptable substitute, and everything went slightly wrong. You took a thick slice of bread, you held it on a long fork or laid it under the griller, and you toasted it until it was properly golden and faintly charred at the edges. Then, while it was still hot enough to melt anything it touched, you spread it with beef dripping straight from the tin. The fat melted immediately into the bread. You added a pinch of salt. You ate it standing up because it was too good to wait until you reached the table. There are people alive today who will tell you, with complete sincerity and absolutely no irony, that dripping toast was the best thing they ever ate for breakfast. And I believe them, because the combination of properly rendered beef fat, hot toast, and salt is a flavour that operates on a frequency that no avocado or smashed anything can reach. It was simple, it was cheap, it was perfect. Crushing SAO crackers for crumbing SAOs were the Australian kitchen's secret weapon for coating anything that needed crumbing, and happened to coincide with a week where the breadcrumbs had run out, which seemed to happen remarkably often. A sleeve of SAOs, a rolling pin, and a clean tea towel was all you needed. You put the crackers in the towel, folded it over, and rolled until you had fine crumbs. They coated chicken schnitzel, crumbed lamb cutlets, fish fillets, even slices of tomato before they hit the pan. The SAO crumb was lighter than standard breadcrumbs, slightly saltier, and gave a thinner, crisper crust that browned beautifully in a pan with a good spoonful of dripping. There it is again. Dripping. It just keeps coming up. There is a reason for that. This trick showed up in community cookbooks across Australia from the 1940s onwards, often in the margins, added by hand after the original recipe was printed, because this was the kind of knowledge that spread between neighbours and at CWA meetings and across back fences, not through official channels, just between cooks who had worked something out and wanted to share it. Stretching cordial syrup with water. Australians have always had a complicated and deeply loving relationship with cordial. Raspberry, lemon, lime, orange. The bottles lined up on the shelf like a rainbow that only existed in suburban kitchens and school canteens, and the art of making a bottle of cordial last was something every Australian child understood implicitly, even if they resented it enormously. You poured your glass mostly full of water, and then you added the cordial, not the other way around. And you added less than you thought you needed, and then a little more. The ratio was a subject of ongoing negotiation in most households. The adults made it weaker. The kids wanted it stronger. The compromise tasted objectively better than either extreme. But there was also the habit of using the very last of the cordial, when the bottle was nearly empty and the syrup was too thick and sweet to drink straight, as a flavouring for cakes, icing, and even jelly. A rinse of the bottle with a cup of hot water gave you enough concentrated syrup to flavour a batch of icing that tasted more intensely of raspberry than anything you could buy. It was the kind of thinking that made every bottle worth twice what you paid for it. Rolling Lamington offcuts into rum balls. And every Australian who has ever attempted to make Lamingtons at home knows the offcut problem. You bake your sponge, you cut it into neat squares, and the edges that got a bit too done or a bit too crumbly or simply do not look presentable enough to dip in chocolate and coconut, those go onto a separate plate. In a lesser kitchen, they get eaten standing up at the bench before anyone notices. In a proper Australian kitchen, they get turned into rum balls. The offcuts were crumbled finely, mixed with a generous amount of cocoa powder, sweetened condensed milk, and a splash of rum if there was any in the house, or a splash of rum essence if there was not. The mixture was rolled into balls, then rolled again through desiccated coconut or chocolate, hundreds and thousands. Then they went into the fridge to firm up. These rum balls were better than the Lamingtons that created them. Denser, richer, more intensely chocolatey. They became a staple of every Christmas plate, every school fundraiser tray, every CWA contribution. And they started as something that was nearly thrown away. That is the whole story of Australian cooking. Right there in a chocolate ball. Nothing wasted. Everything made better. These 20 habits did not come from cookbooks or cooking shows or influences with good lighting and a ring light. They came from people who understood their kitchens deeply and their ingredients completely. People